The weapon that no longer scares. For decades, the United States didn't rule the world with tanks or troops. It ruled with a currency. The dollar wasn't just money, it was leverage. It was control. It was a weapon more powerful than any missile ever built. If a country obeyed the rules of the system, it got access to dollars, trade, credit, and growth. If it didn't, the punishment was swift and devastating. Sanctions, frozen reserves, financial isolation, entire economies cut off with the flip of a switch. SWIFT wasn't just a messaging system, it was a choke collar, and for a long time it worked perfectly. The dollar sat at the center of global trade. Oil was priced in it, debt was issued in it, reserves were stored in it. Every major economy needed dollars to function, which meant every major economy had to play by America's rules. That was the deal. But weapons lose power when they're overused. In the last decade, the dollar stopped being a neutral medium of exchange and became an explicit tool of punishment. Sanctions weren't rare or targeted anymore. They became routine, predictable, permanent. Entire nations watched their foreign reserves, money they believed was untouchable, seized overnight. Trillions of dollars, frozen with no legal recourse, no appeals process, no exit. That moment changed everything. Because when reserves can be frozen, they are no longer reserves. They are permissions. And permissions can be revoked. From that point on, countries stopped asking, "Is the dollar stable?" They started asking a much more dangerous question. What happens when we're next? This is where the narrative breaks. De-dollarization isn't about politics. It isn't about ideology. It isn't about rejecting the West. It's about survival. When a system proves it can be weaponized against you, rational actors don't protest. They adapt, quietly, strategically, without announcements or headlines. They reduce exposure. They diversify reserves. They move trade outside the system. They stockpile assets that can't be frozen, canceled, or deleted with a keystroke. This isn't rebellion, it's insurance. And the most dangerous part for the dollar isn't that countries are leaving loudly, it's that they're leaving silently. No press conferences, no declarations of war, just fewer dollars in reserves, more bilateral trade agreements, more gold moving into central bank vaults. Because here's the truth most people don't want to hear. The dollar's power was never infinite. It was conditional. It worked as long as the world believed the system was fair, predictable, and safe. The moment that belief cracked, the weapon lost its psychological edge. And when a weapon stops scaring people, it doesn't matter how big it is. When a weapon gets used too often, people learn how to survive it. That's exactly what's happening now. And the consequences of that shift are far bigger than most people realize. The illusion of power, how the dollar became a global chain. The world did not choose the dollar, it accepted it. After World War II, the global economy lay in ruins. Europe was shattered, Asia was rebuilding from ashes, and the United States emerged as the only major power with its industrial base intact, its gold reserves full, and its financial system operational. Out of that imbalance came Bretton Woods. On paper, it looked like cooperation, stability, a new global order designed to prevent future wars and economic collapse. The dollar was pegged to gold. Other currencies were pegged to the dollar. Trade could flow again. Trust could be rebuilt. But beneath the surface, something far more permanent was taking shape. The dollar didn't just become a currency, it became infrastructure. Oil was priced in dollars. International trade settled in dollars. Sovereign debt issued in dollars. Global banks structured their balance sheets around dollars. If you wanted to participate in the global economy, you needed access to the dollar system. There was no alternative lane. There was no opt-out button. This created a quiet but absolute hierarchy. The United States could print the currency everyone else needed. The rest of the world had to earn it. Countries exported real goods, labor, resources, manufacturing capacity, in exchange for paper claims denominated in dollars. America imported those goods and paid with liabilities it alone could create at will. That wasn't free trade, that was privilege. As long as the system appeared stable, few questioned it. Growth was strong. Globalization lifted billions out of poverty. Supply chains expanded. Credit was abundant. The illusion worked because the machine kept running. But dependence is not the same as consent. Any nation that stepped outside the dollar system quickly learned the cost. Cut off from dollar funding, trade became expensive or impossible. Banks lost access to correspondent networks. Imports dried up. Inflation followed. Political pressure mounted. Countries outside the system weren't just disadvantaged, they were isolated. This is how the dollar became a chain rather than a choice. It bound the global economy together, but always with one hand holding the key. As long as that key was never used aggressively, the system felt neutral, almost benevolent. But neutrality was an illusion. The power was always there. It just wasn't exercised openly. And that illusion of stability is what made the system so effective. People believed the rules were fixed, that access to dollars was permanent, that reserves were untouchable, that trade was apolitical. It worked because trust masked dependency. The problem with chains is not that they exist. It's that once you notice them, you start asking who controls them. And once that question enters the system, the illusion of power begins to crack.
The breaking point, when the dollar stopped being neutral. For most of the modern financial era, one assumption held the global system together. No matter how ugly politics became, money was supposed to remain neutral. Wars could happen. Alliances could shift. Governments could fall. But reserves were untouchable. Central banks stored dollars with the belief that once those funds were earned, settled, and booked, they were safe. Above retaliation, above punishment, above geopolitics. That belief wasn't written into law. It didn't need to be. It was cultural. It was assumed. Then it was shattered in a single move. When foreign currency reserves were frozen, the world saw something it had never seen before at that scale. Money that nations believed they owned was rendered inaccessible overnight, not seized through conquest, not lost through default, simply switched off. No trial, no warning, no mechanism to recover it. That moment rewired how central banks think. Because reserves are not meant to generate returns, they exist for one reason only: survival. To be available in emergencies, to stabilize currencies when panic hits, to function when nothing else does. When reserves can be frozen, they fail that purpose completely. And from that realization came a sentence that quietly spread through monetary authorities around the world. If it can be frozen, it's not a reserve. That sentence changed everything. From that point forward, the dollar stopped being a shield and became a risk. Holding dollars no longer meant safety. It meant exposure. Exposure not just to inflation or interest rate policy, but to political alignment and favor. Neutrality was gone. The dollar had crossed a line from infrastructure to instrument. History had seen this logic before. In 1933, American citizens learned the same lesson when the U.S. government confiscated gold from its own population. Private ownership was criminalized. Gold was seized at a fixed price, and shortly after, the official price was raised. The transfer of wealth was legal, decisive, and irreversible. The message was identical then as it is now. If you don't control the asset, you don't own it. Gold holders in 1933 learned that laws change when systems are under stress. Central banks watching reserve freezes learned the same thing nearly a century later. Different asset, same principle. What mattered wasn't the justification. What mattered was the precedent. Once it happened, it could happen again. From that moment on, every dollar reserve carried an invisible condition attached to it, not written on balance sheets, but understood by anyone paying attention. Alignment mattered. Obedience mattered. Permission mattered. And reserves that depend on permission are not reserves at all. The freeze didn't destroy the dollar. It did something far more dangerous. It destroyed the illusion that the system was neutral. And when neutrality dies, trust follows soon after. Gold, bricks, and the exit without noise. No empire is challenged head-on at the peak of its monetary power. That would be suicide. Reserve currencies don't fall because someone attacks them. They fall because people stop depending on them. There are no declarations, no press conferences, no dramatic end-of-the-dollar announcements. What's happening now is far more subtle and far more dangerous. Central banks across the world are buying gold at the fastest pace in modern history, not as a hedge, not as speculation, but as a strategic replacement for trust that no longer exists. These are institutions whose entire purpose is stability, quietly moving away from assets that can be frozen toward assets that can't be touched. Gold doesn't rely on clearing systems. It doesn't depend on political alignment. It doesn't require permission. At the same time, global trade is quietly rerouting itself. Energy deals settled in yuan. Regional trade priced in local currencies. Bilateral agreements structured to avoid dollar clearing altogether. Even direct barter, goods exchanged for resources without money changing hands. None of this is framed as rebellion. It's framed as efficiency, as diversification, as pragmatism. But the direction is unmistakable. The BRICS nations are not creating a new global currency to overthrow the dollar. That narrative misunderstands how power actually fades. Building a replacement invites retaliation. It forces confrontation. It accelerates conflict. Instead, they're doing something far smarter. They're reducing exposure. Fewer dollars in reserves, less trade settled in dollars, more autonomy in payment systems. This isn't an attack. It's an exit. And the most telling detail is the silence. The smartest players never leave last. They leave first, while liquidity is still deep, while markets can absorb the shift without panic, while exits remain open. They don't warn. They don't explain. They don't convince. They simply reposition. History follows this pattern relentlessly. The British pound didn't collapse overnight. It faded as trade routes shifted, as colonies diversified reserves, as confidence quietly drained away. By the time the loss of reserve status was obvious, the decision had already been made decades earlier. Imperial currencies don't die in crisis. They die in comfort. They die when the world still pretends everything is fine, while dependency disappears in the background. That's what makes this moment so dangerous. The dollar is still strong. Markets are still deep. Confidence still exists, which is exactly when the smartest exits happen. Because once a reserve currency becomes a liability, no one waits for permission to leave. They just stop using it. And that's how empires lose their currencies, not with noise, but with absence. Many people ask the wrong question. They ask why the United States doesn't simply change course, why it doesn't restore trust, reduce debt, and stabilize the system. The uncomfortable truth is that it can't. The United States is no longer managing the system. It is trapped inside it. The modern American economy is built on debt at every level. Government spending depends on borrowing. Corporate growth depends on cheap credit. Financial markets depend on constant liquidity. The system doesn't function unless new debt replaces old debt continuously. Debt requires printing, not in theory, but in practice. When obligations grow faster than real economic output, the only way to service them is to expand the money supply. This is no longer a policy choice. It is a mathematical requirement. But printing only works as long as trust exists. A currency can be created infinitely. Confidence cannot. For decades, the dollar enjoyed a unique privilege. The world trusted it not because it was perfect, but because it was predictable, neutral, safe. That trust allowed the United States to print without immediate consequences. That era is ending. The moment the dollar became a tool of pressure, that trust began to erode. Every sanction, every freeze, every exclusion from the system reinforced the same lesson. Holding dollars means accepting political risk. And once trust fades, the trap closes. Raising interest rates to defend the currency breaks the domestic economy. Higher rates explode debt servicing costs, crush housing markets, destabilize banks, and trigger recessions. The government cannot sustain them for long without political and economic backlash. Lowering interest rates to protect growth destroys the currency. It signals desperation. It accelerates capital flight. It confirms that debt will be inflated away rather than repaid. There is no winning move. Every option leads to damage. The only difference is where that damage appears first. This is the core contradiction of a debt-based empire. The system demands constant expansion, but expansion depends on trust that is now decaying. You cannot shrink debt without collapse, and you cannot inflate it without consequence. This is why policy responses look increasingly frantic. Emergency liquidity programs, hidden bailouts, rebranded money printing, carefully chosen language designed to maintain confidence while doing the opposite. These are not signs of control. They are signs of entrapment. The United States cannot simply step back without triggering the very crisis it's trying to avoid. Every attempt to stabilize the system deepens dependence on the same tools that are destroying trust. That is why this process cannot be stopped with legislation, elections, or speeches. It ends the same way every time, not through reform, but through exhaustion. There is no clean exit from a debt-based empire. Only slow erosion, shrinking options, and the quiet realization that the system no longer responds to intent, only to gravity. This is not the end of the dollar. That narrative is too simple, too dramatic, too clean. What's ending is something far more important. It's privilege. For decades, the dollar existed outside the normal rules of history. It could expand without consequence. It could absorb shocks that would have destroyed any other currency. It could export inflation, enforce compliance, and still be treated as the safest asset on Earth. That era is fading. The world that replaces it will not be unified. It will not be stable, and it will not be comfortable. As the dollar's dominance weakens, the global system fragments. Trade splits into regional blocks. Payment systems multiply. Alliances become transactional instead of ideological. Countries hedge against each other rather than trust a single center of gravity. Fragmentation means friction, and friction means volatility. Price stability becomes the exception, not the rule. Currency swings grow larger. Capital moves faster. Crises spread more quickly and resolve more slowly. Markets stop reacting to fundamentals and start reacting to fear, liquidity, and political risk. Volatility isn't a phase. It's the new baseline. This is why inflation no longer behaves the way people expect. It doesn't surge once and disappear. It lingers. It resurfaces. It moves unevenly through the system, hitting essentials first and hardest: food, energy, housing, insurance. the things people can't opt out of. Inflation stops being a temporary problem and becomes a structural feature. Not because policymakers are incompetent, but because the system they're managing no longer allows clean outcomes. Every intervention solves one problem by creating two more. In this environment, assets based on promises lose their appeal. Bonds depend on repayment. Currencies depend on restraint. Financial products depend on counterparties behaving as expected. But when trust erodes, promises lose weight. That's why capital begins migrating toward assets without obligations attached. Assets that don't require belief in a future policy decision. Assets that don't depend on someone else's discipline, honesty, or solvency. Not because they're perfect, but because they're final. This shift doesn't happen overnight. It happens gradually, unevenly, and quietly. Most people don't notice it while it's happening. They notice it later, when prices feel unstable, when savings don't stretch as far, when the old assumptions stop working. By then, the transition is already well underway. This is how empires always decline. Not with alarms, not with collapses, but with normalization, with constant reassurances that everything is fine, with experts explaining why this time is manageable, with people adjusting expectations downward, 1 year at a time. Empires don't collapse loudly. They fade, while everyone insists everything is fine. The dollar isn't disappearing. It's becoming ordinary. And when the world's most powerful currency loses its extraordinary status, every system built on that privilege must adapt. The only real question left is this: when the dollar loses its weapon, what do you think replaces it?